Right now, 25 million people. I mean, that is literally half the population of Sudan. They are facing acute hunger.
Yeah.
Over 150,000 people are dead.
Mhm.
And something like 13.6 million people have been forced to flee their homes.
It's an unbelievable scale of human suffering.
It really is.
Yeah.
And yet, if you turn on the nightly news, you'd honestly think this was just some sort of isolated, forgotten tragedy.
Right.
Like it's just this grim situation happening in a neat little conceptual box far away from the rest of the world.
Yeah, that is such a profound misconception. I mean, people use that phrase, forgotten war, almost as like a coping mechanism for information overload.
Oh, interesting. Like we just can't process it all.
Exactly. Because if a conflict isn't, dominating the front page every day,
Yeah.
we tend to assume it's just a purely domestic issue, like it's contained within its own borders. But the data tells a completely different story.
Which is exactly why today, for this deep dive, we're basically going to shatter that misconception.
We have to.
Because when you actually open up the hood and look at the engine of this conflict, Sudan isn't forgotten at all. It is a highly internationalized, like hyper-connected, multi-billion-dollar geopolitical battleground.
Yeah, the amount of money and influence flowing in and out is staggering.
It really is. And we've been poring over an incredible stack of intelligence for this deep dive. We're talking a leaked UN expert report, an Arab news investigation that actually tracks illicit gold, and, well, geopolitical analyses from the Finnish Institute of International Affairs.
Right, the FIAA report.
And responsible statecraft, too. Plus on-the-ground data from the UN Development Program. And, what emerges from all these sources is, honestly, a masterclass in how fragile states are just systematically dismantled.
And I think we should probably clarify our approach before we really jump in.
Oh, absolutely.
Because we're going to look at the historical origins, the key actors, and, the strategic drivers of this war. But our aim here isn't to take political sides or endorse any specific geopolitical viewpoint.
Right, exactly. We're strictly looking at the intelligence in the reports.
Right. We're conducting a completely neutral, objective exploration. We're just mapping out the complex web of domestic and external forces shaping this crisis, tracing cause and effect based entirely on the research provided.
Perfect. So to really understand how we got to this massive international proxy battle, we need to wind the clock back first. We have to look at the domestic timeline.
Yeah, who is actually fighting and why?
Exactly. Because if you go back to, 2018 and 2019, Sudan was actually making global headlines for a very different reason.
A much more hopeful reason, really.
Right. There was this massive, nonviolent pro-democracy uprising. I mean, millions of regular people just took to the streets and actually managed to oust Omar al-Bashir.
Who had been this authoritarian leader in power for, what, decades?
Yeah, exactly. He was deeply entrenched. So you had this genuine grassroots democratic momentum. It felt like a monumental shift.
It did. And the initial agreement there was to establish a civil-military transitional government. The idea was to slowly move toward full civilian rule.
But that obviously didn't happen.
No. The major turning point, the moment that basically derailed everything, happened in October 2021.
The coup.
Exactly. Two military figures who had initially, agreed to this transition decided to just hijack it.
So introduce us to those two figures, because
Yeah.
for anyone listening, they are basically the central domestic players here.
Right. So first you have General al-Burhan. He's the leader of the Sudanese Armed Forces, or the SF.
The SAF, got it.
And the SF has the institutional backing of former Bashir allies. They essentially control the traditional state apparatus, the formal military.
Okay, and who's the second?
The second figure is Hemedti, and he leads the Rapid Support Forces, the RSF.
And the RSF isn't a normal army.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
The RSF isn't a standard military unit. It's a massive, highly decentralized paramilitary group. They operate through this really vast network of militias.
Okay, so in 2021, Burhan and Hemedti team up.
Yeah, they team up, they launch a coup, and they seize joint control of the state. They push the civilians out.
But, history shows us that marriages of convenience between two heavily armed rival factions rarely end well.
Almost never.
And by April 2023, the whole country explodes into full-scale war because these two generals turn their guns on each other.
Right, the alliance just completely fractures.
The spark was reportedly this disagreement over how and when the RSF paramilitary would be integrated into the national army. But honestly, looking at this timeline, this feels less like a battle over a political vision for the country and more like, I don't know, a hostile corporate takeover.
A corporate takeover.
Yeah, where the ultimate prize is just the nation's wealth. It's gold, copper, oil, Not ideological, just purely transactional.
Well, the research heavily validates that analogy. If you look closely at their motivations, competing claims to national wealth are the primary domestic drivers here.
Not some unifying political or religious ideology.
Not at all. You have two massive, well-armed corporate structures basically colliding over who gets the monopoly on resource extraction.
Wow.
And the tragic part is that this elite power struggle has turned the civilian population into collateral damage. I mean, the reports we're looking at detail absolute devastation.
It is horrific. We're talking about the siege of El Fasher, for instance, which is the last major city held by the National Army in the Darfur region.
The human cost there is just staggering.
Yeah, the level of destruction combined with these waves of targeted ethnic violence in the surrounding areas. And the point is, the civilian death toll isn't an accident.
No, it's not.
It is a direct byproduct of how this war is fought.
Because the conflict has essentially transformed Sudan into a resource extraction zone, the factions view territory, well, not in terms of governing the people who live there, but in terms of controlling the economic assets beneath their feet.
Right, exactly. So the RSF and the SAF have these massive armies, and sustaining a war of this scale is incredibly expensive.
Very expensive.
So let's follow the money. Specifically, let's look at the gold. Because the Arab News investigation reveals some mind-blowing numbers.
Oh, the gold data is wild.
Before the war, Sudan's official gold production was 87 tons a year.
Right.
But within just 5 months of the fighting breaking out, that official number plummeted to a mere 2 tons.
Right. A near total collapse on paper. But as the investigators point out, that collapse is just an illusion.
It's all going underground.
Exactly. It's masking this booming hidden economy. They estimate that 100 kilograms of illicit gold vanishes across Sudan's borders every single day.
Every single day. That's insane.
Yeah. Since April 2023, that adds up to over 60 tons of smuggled gold.
To put that in perspective for anyone listening, this isn't just, corrupt officials pocketing a little extra cash on the side. This is the lifeblood of the entire war economy.
It's funding the whole operation.
Right. So the SAF, who controls the state structures in some of the key production areas, they generated $1.6 billion in 2024 from official exports.
And they absolutely need that money.
Because their war expenditure is reportedly a staggering $1 million a day.
Just burning through cash.
Meanwhile, the RSF relies almost entirely on vast cross-border smuggling networks. The data shows that just one external actor's refineries absorbed 46 tons of RSF-controlled gold in a single year.
And that was worth what? $2.8 billion?
Yeah, $2.8 billion.
And we really need to understand the physical reality of how that gold is extracted, because the reports mention these artisanal pits.
What does that mean practically?
Well, we are not talking about modern industrialized mining operations with heavy machinery. We're talking about desperate people, often civilians, digging by hand in dangerous, completely unregulated holes in the ground in places like Darfur.
Wow.
Yeah, the ore is extracted there, and then we see this direct, almost mechanical conversion.
From gold to weapons.
Exactly. The raw gold is moved out of the war zone through these parallel smuggling networks. It gets legitimized in foreign refineries and then converted almost instantly into imported artillery, foreign drones, and salaries for militia fighters.
Okay, so this brings up a glaring question for me.
Sure.
If investigative journalists and UN experts can track this in, if they know exactly how much gold is moving, where it's being refined, and that it is directly purchasing the drones dropping bombs on civilians, why do international sanctions seem completely useless here?
It's a great question.
Is the global financial system simply incapable of stopping this?
It's highly capable, actually, but it is being expertly bypassed through a concept analysts call networked adaptability.
Networked adaptability?
Right. Look at what happened in June 2024. The U.S. Treasury sanctioned 7 specific firms linked to the SF. The intention, obviously, was to choke off their financial supply lines.
Let me guess. The network just shifted.
Yeah.
It's like playing geopolitical whack-a-mole. You sanction a shell company in one country, and by the end of the week, the exact same operation just opens a new bank account next door under a different name.
That is precisely what happened. Within a matter of weeks, the RSF-aligned networks simply rerouted their gold exports.
Just like that.
Yeah, they started moving the shipments through South Sudan and the Central African Republic, instead of their previous routes.
So the sanctions basically did nothing.
The analysts argue that targeting individual military commanders or specific shell companies is essentially just policy theater.
Policy theater. I like that term.
Because unless regional trading hubs close the loopholes surrounding beneficial ownership, meaning they actually force these shady shell companies to reveal the real human beings profiting behind the scenes, the network will just adapt and survive.
They'll always find a new buyer.
Always.
Okay, so the RSF has built this massive $2.8 billion war chest from smuggled gold. And the SA is spending $1 million a day. But, cash in a bank account doesn't shoot.
Right.
How are they physically converting that illicit wealth into the drones and artillery we're seeing on the battlefield? Like, who's actually selling to them?
This is where we need to zoom out. We have to look at the external states treating Sudan like a geopolitical chessboard.
Yeah, let's get into the foreign actors.
The analyses from the Finnish Institute of International Affairs and Responsible Statecraft provide crucial context here. We are looking at a deeply multipolar battlefield. Let's start with the regional players.
Okay, who's first?
You have Egypt, which firmly backs the SAF, the formal army.
And what's their angle?
Egypt's motivations are deeply tied to its own domestic security and regional leverage. First, they want stability on their southern border to manage the massive influx of refugees pouring out of Sudan.
Makes sense.
But strategically, Egypt needs a strong allied government in Khartoum to support them in their ongoing high-stakes dispute with Ethiopia over the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam.
Oh, right, because that dam affects the flow of the Nile River.
Exactly. It's an existential issue for Egypt.
Okay, so then on the flip side, you have the United Arab Emirates, and the sources indicate the UAE backs the opposing side, the RSF.
Right.
Their interests appear much more focused on resource extraction and food security, specifically securing access to Sudan's gold and these vast tracts of agricultural land.
And there's also a major infrastructure component.
Yeah, the ports. The UAE previously planned this massive $6 billion Red Sea port project called Port Abu Amama, but the SF-led government actually canceled that deal.
Right. And we must highlight a significant finding from the leaked UN expert report you mentioned earlier.
Oh, this is the part about the cargo flights.
Yes. The UN experts documented a consistent pattern of cargo flights. They called it an air bridge of Ilyushin transport planes flying from the UAE into neighboring Chad.
Into Chad, which borders Sudan.
Right. The report alleges these flights were supplying the RSF and deliberately avoiding radar detection.
Wow.
Now, we must be absolutely clear on the diplomatic record here. The UAE vehemently denies these allegations.
Right. They push back hard on that.
Yes. They maintain they are acting strictly as a humanitarian entity in the region, and they point out that the UN panel couldn't definitively prove the exact contents of those cargo planes.
But regardless of the denials, this geopolitical tension is a central pillar of the conflict's analysis.
Absolutely. And it's an incredibly crowded field, too. The regional powers are just the first layer.
Yeah, when you look globally, it gets even more complicated. Iran is reportedly supplying Vulture 6 drones to the SF.
Man, their motivation.
Well, they're hoping to secure a naval base on the Red Sea. Then you have Russia operating through the Wagner Group. Well, they're rebranded as the Africa Corps now.
Right, the Africa Corps.
They initially backed the RSF because they needed Sudanese gold to fund their own war in Ukraine. But the reports show Russia actually switched sides in 2024 to back the SFF.
And why did they switch?
Again, to secure a naval base at Port Sudan. They just flipped. And then China is reportedly providing arms to both sides, trying to protect a $1.3 billion export market and a $140 million harbor project.
When you lay out all those competing interests, it really illustrates a fundamental shift in how modern global alliances function.
It really does. Because this isn't like the old Cold War proxy battles.
Right, where you had two neat ideological sides fighting for a global vision of democracy versus communism.
Exactly. This dynamic behaves much more like venture capitalists funding rival startups.
That's a fascinating way to put it.
Well, think about it. These foreign powers aren't emotionally attached to the CEO, whether that's Burhan or Hamidti. They just want the best return on their investment. Whether that return is a naval base on the Red Sea, millions of acres of agricultural land, or just a steady flow of cheap gold.
That venture capitalist analogy captures the dynamic perfectly. The FEIA report actually coins a specific term for this exact behavior:
Awesome.
opportunistic entanglement.
Opportunistic entanglement.
Yeah, it means relationships are highly transactional and totally devoid of ideological loyalty. To highlight just how pragmatic this is, look at Egypt and the UAE.
Right.
Inside Sudan, they are backing opposing military forces. They are effectively fighting a proxy war against each other.
Right, but outside of Sudan.
Outside of Sudan, they are incredibly close economic partners. The UAE recently invested $35 billion in Egypt's Ras El Hekma development project.
So they're literally writing $35 billion checks to each other in one arena while funding opposing armies in another.
Exactly.
It proved that modern alliances are completely issue-based.
It's a calculated, pragmatic approach to foreign policy that just separates distinct geopolitical goals. But while it might make sense on a diplomatic chessboard, the structural outcomes for the region are catastrophic.
Because a war fueled by transnational transactional interests cannot possibly be contained within the borders of one nation. The spillover is inevitable.
It is.
Let's look at the direct spillover into Chad using the data from the UN Development Program. The scale of this is hard to fathom.
It really is.
Over 1 million displaced people have crossed the border from Sudan into Chad. This has pushed Chad's eastern border provinces, specifically places like Wadai and Sila, way past their breaking point.
Yeah, to understand the physical strain on the ground, the UNDP notes that in Wadai alone, the population has increased by 42% purely from the influx of refugees.
A 42% population increase.
Yes, in just one region.
You cannot just drop a 42% population increase onto an already fragile region without the local infrastructure completely buckling. I mean, there isn't enough water, there aren't enough hospitals, and the security apparatus is overwhelmed.
Right.
The UNDP report states that simply attempting to secure this border and manage the crisis is costing the Chadian government $3 million every single month.
Which completely crowds out their own domestic development goals.
The instability is literally bleeding across the map.
And this brings us to a major analytical point regarding the structural failure of international conflict resolution.
Oh, the peace talks.
Right. There have been numerous high-profile peace talks in Jeddah, in Geneva, but they consistently flounder. They fail to produce any lasting ceasefire.
Wait, hold on. Let's look at that. We're talking about peace talks in Geneva and Jeddah.
Yeah.
But if we look at the research we just walked through, aren't the countries acting as neutral mediators at these peace conferences the exact same ones, secretly flying in drones and laundering the conflict gold?
In many cases, yes.
How is that not just a complete illusion? Like, how can the arsonist be trusted to put out the fire?
That is a deeply critical observation, and the scholarly perspective on conflict management backs it up completely. Regional multilateral organizations like the African Union and IGAD have struggled immensely to maintain any unified approach to Sudan, precisely because their own member states have competing covert interests.
It's a massive conflict of interest.
Right. The modern approach to international mediation has become, much like the war itself, purely transactional.
Meaning they aren't trying to solve the root causes of the violence at all.
Precisely. Mediators often attempt to buy a temporary peace by simply splitting the nation's resources and political power among the heavily armed warlords.
They just divvy up the pie.
Yeah, they focus on top-down agreements over who gets to control the seaports and the gold mines. But this approach only formalizes the corporate takeover we discussed earlier.
It rewards the violence.
Exactly. It guarantees long-term instability because it completely ignores the deep domestic grievances, the demand for democratic governance, and the actual survival needs of the civilian population.
So if you are looking at all this data, what is the ultimate takeaway? The core insight from this stack of research is that fragile states do not just collapse on their own from internal friction.
No, they don't.
They are actively dismantled. Sudan is being pulled apart by a complex global ecosystem of illicit resource extraction, shifting alliances, and regional power competition.
The conflict in Sudan serves as a harsh mirror reflecting the realities of our current multipolar world. It shows us a landscape where geopolitical pragmatism and, the relentless pursuit of strategic assets often completely overshadow human rights and democratic transitions.
Because the incentives are all wrong.
Exactly. When a nation's wealth can be so easily dug out of the ground, digitized in foreign markets, and then used to buy weapons, the war becomes a self-sustaining machine.
And while the international powers are busy sitting in Geneva or Jeddah, having these elite top-down negotiations with generals over who gets to keep the ports and the gold, There is an entirely different, almost invisible reality happening on the ground.
A much more inspiring one, too.
Yeah. The FBI report briefly mentions these groups called Emergency Response Rooms, or
Oh,
ERs.
right, the ERs.
These are local, unarmed civilian mutual aid networks. In the complete absence of a functioning government, regular citizens are organizing themselves to distribute food, find medical supplies, and basically keep millions of Sudanese people alive.
They represent a truly localized model of resilience and governance. And crucially, they operate completely outside the transactional logic of the warlords and the foreign powers.
They're just people helping people.
Right. They are the remnants of that original 2018 democratic spirit, fighting simply to survive.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought to mull over as we wrap up this deep dive. If the diagnostic X-ray of this conflict shows us a disease of global opportunism, where international actors continually try to broker transactional deals with the very warlords tearing the country apart, what would happen if we changed the formula?
It's a huge question.
What if the international community stopped funding the corporate takeover and instead invested its diplomatic and financial power directly into the citizens, the mutual aid networks, and the local leaders actually fighting to rebuild their own state?
It would completely upend the current model.
Maybe the cure for a fragile state isn't found in a foreign boardroom, but in the hands of the people actually doing the healing.